I wasn't supposed to find this. That was the first thought when my hand closed around the warped leather spine buried beneath decades of mildew and mouse droppings. The building wasn't even listed on the county records, just a crumbling brick husk clinging to the backwoods of Hart County, Kentucky. I'd only found it because of a line scrawled in the margin of a 1912 land survey, see Hartwell Ledger, unregistered. The word unregistered had hooked me like a fish. The air inside clung wet to my lungs. It smelled of soil rot and old iron, like a storm cellar that hadn't been opened since before the Civil War. My flashlight caught a staircase sagging into the basement, steps buried in moss, a handrail thick with cobweb. Each creak of wood echoed too long, as though the house itself was listening. At the far wall, hidden behind a sheet of rusted tin, I found the ledger. The leather was swollen from damp, its brass clasp green with corrosion. A black ribbon sealed the edges, a crude binding someone had added later, someone who wanted it closed. I carried it to a crate, laid it flat, and cut the ribbon with my pocket knife. The first pages were nearly blank, the ink bled into gray stains. But further in, the script sharpened. Dates, 1792. Names, Hartwell. 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 The repetition pressed down like a drumbeat, the same surname scrawled in every margin, every tally, every entry. The handwriting shifted across sections, different hands over decades, but the pattern was constant. Beside each name was a mark, sometimes a number, sometimes a cross, sometimes nothing but a thick black slash. Whole lines were scratched out, as though someone had tried to erase a memory with force. One detail kept snagging me. A single number repeated at irregular intervals, 37. It appeared beside births, beside deaths, even beside property exchanges. Once it was carved so hard into the page that the paper tore, the jagged impression bleeding through to the next leaf. I flipped deeper and found several pages entirely blackened. Not with ink, not with fire, something else. The paper was rubbed with ash, smeared into unreadable silence. Whoever had done this hadn't wanted to remove words. They'd wanted to smother them. By the time I reached the back cover, my fingers were shaking. The final entry was dated 1834, and though the ink was faded, I could still make it out. The doctrine is preserved. Hartwell remains whole. All others, erased. My mouth went dry. The phrasing wasn't genealogical, it was theological. Doctrine. Preserved. Erased. A family record rewritten as scripture. I should have shut the book, left it there in the basement where it had slept for almost 2 centuries. But I couldn't. Because something inside me had shifted. It wasn't curiosity, it was compulsion. The ledger wasn't just a record of births and deaths. It was an inventory. A ritual. A set of rules that someone had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. And now, because I had opened it, I had to know what they were. I thought the ledger was the end of it. A relic. A curiosity best left to rot in that basement. But when I began searching the county archives for the Hartwell name, something caught my eye, a line buried in an 1801 government report on educational enterprises in the Western Territories. The Hartwell Seminary for the Improvement of Youth, chartered under the care of Reverend Elias Hartwell, Kentucky, 1799. I froze. Seminary. Improvement. Reverend. It sounded like one of those short-lived frontier schools meant to civilize the wilderness. But the ledger had spoken of doctrine. Not arithmetic, not scripture, something older, something guarded. The official narrative was flawless. The seminary, according to pamphlets preserved at the Louisville Historical Society, claimed to raise orphans of the frontier, educate the poor, and mold upright citizens for the young republic. Elias Hartwell was depicted as a benefactor, his pale eyes sketched above a noble jaw, framed in the stiff posture of Federalist portraiture. His motto, printed beneath, from wilderness, order. And yet, the more I read, the less order I saw. Enrollment lists were short. Always fewer than a dozen pupils per year. No records of graduation, transfer, or dismissal. No employment reports. No marriage certificates. It was as if every child who entered the seminary vanished. One file stopped me cold. A Kentucky Gazette clipping from 1807, neighbors express unease at the isolation of the Hartwell Seminary, whose students are seldom seen beyond its fields. Reverend Hartwell assures all concerned that the children thrive under his strict tutelage, and their absence from public view is, to protect innocence from the corruptions of frontier vice. The phrasing was sterile, but beneath it I heard an echo of the ledger's brutality: preserve Hartwell, erase the others. When I pressed further, I uncovered a thin packet in the state microfilm archives. Inspection notes, Hartwell Seminary, 1815. No author listed. Half the pages missing. But one passage remained: of the children examined, none bore resemblance to local families. Their features bear an uncanny uniformity, though records state they are orphans from diverse counties. Several pupils exhibit identical birthmarks, a pale crescent beneath the left eye. Reverend Hartwell insists this is mere coincidence. Coincidence. My skin crawled as I read. Uniformity. Marks. The ledger's repeated 37 returned to me, hammering against my ribs. And then, buried between accounts of food stores and crop yields, the last page, it should be noted that no student observed here has ever reappeared in public record. Birth certificates vanish. Guardians are untraceable. When pressed for proof, Reverend Hartwell declared, they are not lost. They are whole, within the doctrine. I leaned back from the screen, bile in my throat. A school that produced no graduates. An asylum without the name. An orphanage that erased its orphans. And at the center, a man painted as a reformer, a man who believed he was not educating but preserving. The ledger hadn't been a family archive. It was the seminary's Bible. A doctrine of bloodlines, of bodies consumed into something greater than the individual. I felt it then, the same compulsion as before, not curiosity but inevitability. If the seminary had devoured its children, then where were they? The records insisted the building was demolished after a fire in 1849. Yet the surveyor's notes I found suggested otherwise. Structure unstable, but foundation intact. Lower chambers sealed. Sealed. Like the ledger. Like something meant never to be reopened. And I knew then, I had to find those chambers. I thought the seminary's silence was bureaucratic neglect, poor record-keeping, faded archives. But the deeper I went, the more I saw it wasn't absence. It was erasure. Marriage registries, militia rolls, tax ledgers, every county document that should have carried the names of Hartwell pupils had been methodically scraped clean. Sometimes whole pages remained intact except for a single line, a single name cut away like cancer. In one ledger I found faint indentations where ink had once been, letters dragged backward with a sharp blade until nothing legible remained. The most disturbing evidence came from letters. I unearthed a packet at the Kentucky Historical Society, correspondence between seminary children and distant guardians. The earliest were clumsy, childlike scrawls: "Dear Aunt, I miss the trees by the river. I wish to come home soon." But by the third or fourth page, the handwriting shifted. The tone flattened. Every letter repeated the same phrases: I am learning. I am improving. Reverend Hartwell says I am whole. Dozens of children, different counties, different years, yet every line ended the same. The words were no longer theirs. They had become scripted, as if dictated. It wasn't just the handwriting that sickened me. It was what was missing. Not one letter mentioned a birthday. Not one signed a name. The closest I came to testimony was a faded interview transcript from 1822, found in the margin notes of a Louisville physician's collection. The patient's name was listed only as J. The physician wrote, he recalls being at the seminary as a boy of 12. When asked for his surname, he wept and claimed he had once remembered it carved on a stone wall. He returned to that wall again and again until one day the names were gone, scraped smooth. He says he has not remembered his family name since. He insists it was taken, not lost. Reading those words, my chest tightened. To forget your own name, not through time, not through illness, but by design. And then there was the portrait. In a climate-controlled drawer at the University of Kentucky's archives, I found an oil painting labeled Hartwell Seminary Pupils, circa 1805. 12 children sat stiffly before a dark drape. Their clothes were plain, their posture rigid. But their faces, every face was the same. Not identical twins, but something worse, a dull replication of features, like the painter had run out of imagination. High foreheads, slack jaws, pale crescents beneath each left eye. I pressed my forehead to the glass, staring, trying to convince myself I was wrong. But the longer I looked, the more I realized the horror wasn't in their similarity. It was in their emptiness. None of them seemed to know who they were. The curator had left a note beside the painting, artist unknown. Students unnamed. Unnamed. As if they never had names at all. I closed the file, but the image wouldn't leave me. Those children's faces followed me into my sleep, blank and waiting. The ledger had said, all others, erased. I had assumed it was metaphor. But it wasn't. It was method. The doctrine didn't just consume children. It erased the very idea that they had ever been separate. And as I looked back over the letters, the portraits, the scraped-out records, I realized something that hollowed me to the bone. This wasn't simply a school. It was a machine. A machine built to grind names, memories, and bodies into sameness. And somehow, though the seminary had burned, I could feel that machine still humming beneath the soil. The fire of 1849 had gutted the seminary above ground, but the surveyor's note was right, the foundation still stood. I found it just past a clearing, choked in wild sumac and nettle. Beneath the vines, a flight of stone steps cut into the earth, blackened at the edges, leading to a rusted iron door fused shut. It took me hours with a crowbar, sweat running into my eyes, until the hinges groaned. A stale wind pushed out, damp stone, rot, and something metallic, like old coins pressed against the tongue. I entered with my flashlight and recorder. The first chamber was narrow, lined with alcoves where plaster effigies once stood. Most had crumbled, but a few remained, headless figures in prayer postures, robes sculpted smooth, their hands pressed flat against the wall. Dust shifted when I passed, though there was no breeze. Beyond was a corridor that bent on itself. I walked for what felt like 30 yards, only to emerge where I'd started, the effigies waiting, their broken heads tilted further than before, as though listening. I forced myself down a second passage. This one widened into a hall where the walls bore carvings, lists of names, hundreds of them, etched with care. But every one was gouged through. Whole generations obliterated by a single violent hand. The deeper I looked, the more my light revealed new names bleeding faintly through the gouges, as if the stone itself was trying to remember. At the end of the hall, I found the first sealed chamber. A low, bricked arch, with plaster sagging like wax. I chipped away until the opening gave, revealing a room filled with wooden chairs arranged in a circle, each fitted with leather straps. In the center was a table bearing remnants of glass vials and ceramic bowls crusted with black residue. Journals lay scattered, pages stuck with mold. I pried one free. The entries were clinical, administered tincture to encourage stillness. Subject resisted the silence, but after hours of confinement ceased speech altogether. Identity fractures under deprivation, improved compliance. Another page, opiate dosage increased. Prolonged darkness accelerates forgetting. They repeat Hartwell's words upon release, as if those words were their own. My throat tightened. This wasn't education. It was ritualized erasure. The further I went, the less natural the chambers felt. In one hallway, a flight of stairs descended into blackness. I counted the steps, 24, 25, 26, before the beam of my flashlight caught the iron door I had first entered. I was back where I started, but my own footprints were gone. By then, the air grew colder, though my breath did not fog. In a chamber with walls blackened by fire, I lit a candle from my pack. The flame sputtered, then steadied. I turned to examine the walls, streaked with reddish stains that had bubbled through plaster. When I turned back, the candle had gone out. Except it hadn't. It was still lit, but I could see it both ways, flame and no flame, two realities layered like glass. I blinked hard, and in the moment between, I swear I heard a whisper. Not words, but the sibilance of many mouths speaking at once. I dropped the candle, heart hammering, and scrambled back through the passages. Every effigy seemed closer now, arms raised not in prayer but in warning. When I finally stumbled into the night air, the iron door swung shut behind me with a hollow finality, though I hadn't touched it. And in my recorder, later, when I played it back, there was something beneath my own panicked breathing, a single line repeated in a dozen voices, low and rasping, overlapping like a chant, whole within the doctrine. When I emerged from the seminary's chambers, I told myself I would never return. But dread has its own gravity, and the ledger kept drawing me back. The more I read, the more I realized the seminary was not an isolated aberration, it was a single thread in a tapestry. The clue came from a transfer record hidden in the final pages, ink warped by moisture but still legible. Hartwell pupil reallocated, 1803, sent to St. Cecilia House, Maryland. Doctrinal compliance noted. Mark preserved. Reallocated. Mark preserved. The word sent my stomach cold. If children were moved between institutions, then the seminary was only the beginning. I dug into St. Cecilia House. Officially, it had been a Catholic girls' orphanage established in Baltimore in 1801. The story sounded benign, charity for the abandoned. But the enrollment lists matched the same pattern: no exits, no marriages, no deaths, no paper trail. Just silence. Then I found something worse. A map. Folded into a medical atlas from 1842, preserved in the Louisville Library's restricted collection. Across it, hand-drawn crosses marked sites: Hartwell Seminary in Kentucky, St. Cecilia in Maryland, the dormitory, in coastal Maine, White Ash Retreat, in Virginia. At the center of each cross, a symbol, a circle cleaved by 5 vertical lines, like fingers pressed together. The caption beneath read, Order of the Fifth Veil. The name struck like a match in dry brush. The journals I had found in the seminary chambers suddenly aligned: silence therapy, sensory deprivation, enforced forgetting. The Fifth Veil wasn't one institution. It was a doctrine spanning decades, using schools, orphanages, asylums, any socially acceptable facade. Each branch fed the same hunger: erasure, preservation, sameness. And then the connection grew personal. In a weathered file box at the county courthouse, I found a Hart County census page from 1860. Most lines were unremarkable until I reached one: household number 37, Billet, Charles. Wife, Eliza Hartwell Billet. My own great-great-grandmother's maiden name. Hartwell. I read the line again and again, the number 37 burned into the margin. The same number carved violently through the seminary ledger, the same number that haunted every record. It wasn't coincidence. My family had been tied to the doctrine from the beginning. That night, I dreamed of the seminary's children. Their pale, vacant faces filled the dark, whispering not in voices but in the silence between words. And when I woke, my own name felt thin, fragile, as though it could be scraped away from me with a blade. The doctrine hadn't ended with fire. It had scattered, taken root in new forms, new facades. Schools, clinics, projects, each bearing the circle and 5 marks, the veil. The terrifying truth was not that the Hartwell Seminary existed. It was that it was never meant to stand alone. And if my family name appeared within its ledgers, then the 5th veil was not history. It was inheritance. By the time I traced the 5th veil into the present, I no longer trusted the boundaries between history and now. The archives, the dreams, the whispers in the chambers, they all felt like the same voice, converging. And then I found her. A woman listed in a recent social services intake report, surname redacted, age 17. She bore the crescent birthmark beneath her left eye. The report noted she'd been transferred from a private youth retreat in Virginia. No guardians, no past. Only the word preserved. I managed to speak with her through a contact who owed me favors. She was slight, her eyes both vacant and pleading. She told me her name was Anna, but she said it like a guess, as though testing a word that might not belong to her. "They're still here," she whispered. "Different buildings, different names. They move us when people start asking. Sometimes we don't even remember moving." She pressed something into my hand, a cassette tape, brittle with age. "Play it alone." That night, in the dark, I listened. The recording was filled with static at first. Then a boy's voice, trembling, I don't remember what I was called. "Reverend says names are noise. He says we are only whole if we let go. But I dream. I dream of my mother calling me. I can't hear her voice anymore." Then silence. A click. Another voice, older, female, weary, "Will it matter if I get out? Will anyone even know who I was?" I paused the tape, sick with grief. The seminary hadn't died in 1849. The 5th veil had only refined itself. And I understood the choice before me. I could publish everything. Release the ledger, the tapes, the maps, the names. But it would mean exposing families, mine included, as complicit. Whole lineages would be branded as architects of erasure. Survivors like Anna would be hounded, dissected, doubted until their last scrap of identity was torn away. Or I could burn it all. Erase the records, bury the chambers, protect the few survivors from the glare of exposure, even if it meant the world would never know what was done. Anna's question haunted me, "Will it matter if I get out?" I sat before a stack of papers, ledgers, transcripts, maps, and the cassette tape lying on top like a wound. My lighter trembled in my hand. The flame caught, small and hungry. For a moment, I saw both futures layered like the candle in the chamber, lit and extinguished at once. One path of revelation, one of silence. I made my choice. The lighter dropped. The pages curled, blackened, dissolved into ash. I left the tape untouched, slid it into a drawer, and placed a single white candle beside it. When I struck the match, the flame bent, as if listening. It steadied, burning brighter than it should have. I turned away, heartbreaking, and left it there. A single light in the dark. A name that refused to die. The official report was brief. Unregistered structure destroyed by accidental fire. Records lost. No evidence of unlawful activity. The courthouse clerk signed it with a flourish, as though satisfied to bury 2 centuries of rot under a single bureaucratic sentence. To anyone else, it would look like another colonial ruin left to time. Electrical fault, faulty wiring, sudden collapse, the language shifts with the age, but the purpose is always the same, to explain away silence. When the inspectors cleared the site, they noted only fragments. Miscellaneous paper debris, illegible. Bones, too degraded for identification. Artifacts misfiled, no chain of custody. Their words filed the remains into oblivion as cleanly as the doctrine itself had once done. But something stayed behind. When I returned weeks later, ash crunching beneath my boots, I found it half buried where the iron door had once been, a child's sketch pressed between stone and soot. The page was warped, the lines faint, but the image was unmistakable, 12 figures standing in a circle, each with a crescent mark beneath the left eye. No names written, only one word in a shaky hand at the bottom, remember. I carried it home, slipped it between the ledger's scorched cover and the unburned tape. A fragile bundle of evidence I should have destroyed but couldn't. I thought of the first moment, of my hand brushing that swollen leather spine, of the instinct that whispered, I wasn't supposed to find this, and I realized the doctrine hadn't ended. It had merely changed hands. Because now it was mine. 1.